Our society has unwritten rules as to what is acceptable and what is not when it comes to grief. But what if what you're experiencing is outside of those said rules? Who's to say that I'm supposed to fit everything that I'm experiencing into this tiny sized box of steel that society says I should fit into? Let's dispel some of the myths of grief together.
Hi everyone, this is Jeff and
Tony Brabeck
of Our Little Sparrows, Pregnancy and Infant Loss Support. If you'd like to find out more about our organization, you can use the link in the description below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get alerts every week when we release new content. Let's get started. So in the last episode, we talked about the definitions of grief, and we specifically learned that grief is normal and it's natural. And specifically, it is the reaction to loss. And loss takes on many faces. So if this is true, we have to ask ourselves, why do people avoid talking about death? We have to ask, why do we stop ourselves from showing emotions in front of others and apologizing for it, which is probably the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We also have to ask, why do people refrain from talking about our loved ones who have died? So let's look at 6 myths that we are taught on how to cope with loss in our society. And it's not like, as we're being raised as children, this just comes out and mom and dad, okay, we're going to talk about myth number 1. We're going to talk about no. These are things that our society thinks is normal and second nature. We're taught these things by the way our parents act, react, the way our grandparents act, react, our cousins, our aunts, our uncles. When you're a child, you're always looking at that next, older person to see how they act and react. All right, so let's get into the 6 myths. The 6 myths that we're taught on how to cope with loss in our society, they come from the Grief Recovery Method Handbook specifically today. So the myths on how we deal with loss. And myth number 1 is don't feel bad. And what does this look like as a child? It basically looks like, you got bit by the family dog and mom or dad says, don't feel bad. It's okay. Here, have a cookie. You'll feel better. It's a perfect example.
Or let's say you are a little bit older, you're in a relationship and that relationship ends, and maybe someone who's trying to offer you comfort just says, don't feel bad. Hey, why don't we go shopping and just kind of take our minds off of it for a while? It'll help you feel better. So the idea is that it's not allowing you to necessarily the opportunity to just feel the emotions that you're feeling, but the emphasis is just to try and make you feel better, even though it's just a temporary fix. Yeah.
So they're actually taking away the opportunity that you had to process that loss.
So the second myth is to replace the loss. So, for instance, you lost your dog passed away, and someone says to you, oh, you can just get another one.
Right.
Or in our community, you had a miscarriage and someone tries to offer you comfort, but ends up telling you, oh, you're young, you can try and have another one soon.
Exactly.
And those are well intended to be helpful, but they actually don't help at all.
No.
All it does is just kind of minimizes your experience.
Right.
And doesn't make you feel that they really are making effort to really understand how significant that loss is to you.
Yeah.
So those things will be said to you, and the people that are offering comfort, maybe it's just a conversation we need to have ourselves. Like, is this comment really going to help? How can I really help someone that is going through a really difficult time right now? And we're going to go through that actually in a little bit later,
right.
Things that we can do.
And we talked about it in previous episodes. I think with a lot of these, we have to learn to show grace and give grace where it's needed most. And it's when people are tripping over their own words, whether they realize them or not.
Yeah.
And I think what it comes down to also is like that old cliche, if you don't know what to say, don't say that at all. But what you should say is, I'm here if you need someone to talk to. I could never understand what you're going through. I'm so sorry for your loss. Simple, quick, but, sometimes people step in it.
Yeah.
So the third myth of these 6 myths is to grieve alone. Some people feel like it's their grief and it's only their grief, and I just got to deal with it on my own. That's just not true. There's a time and a place to grieve by yourself. Granted, we totally get that. But at some point, we need to make those graduated. Like I talked about a moment ago, we need to graduate, and start processing through that journey of that grief. In some ways, as children, especially if we lost a loved one, like our parents lost their parent, or what about one of your own parents passed away? If the parent is showing grief and crying, it's been very common to tell the children, you need to leave them alone. You need to be quiet and let them cry. And it's just not healthy, and it's not necessary. And in fact, we need our loved ones around us. We need our children for many reasons to be around us in some of our lowliest moments during our grief process.
Right.
So to say you need to give them space is not asking them what they need, it's telling them what they need. I think that's important too. We don't need to dictate what is good for the other person when we're not that person that's grieving.
Right. The fourth myth is just give it time. We've heard this often, and I'm sure you have as well. The key phrase we hear all around us is that time heals all wounds. I think that's probably one of the main things that we've been told, not just in the last few years, but actually throughout my life, I've heard that as well. And yes, time is a factor in grief. I don't think that time itself heals wounds, because years later, there are still people who are grieving heavily,
right?
For whatever reason.
Or it starts all up again. There's that too.
Or it's a cycle of some sort. And so grief does lessen over time. It becomes less raw, less intense. But I don't think that's an accurate statement. And what does that really mean? Time heals all wounds.
Right.
It doesn't really make logical sense to someone who's grieving.
Right.
And it really, again, just like it does in some of the other myths, it doesn't acknowledge the significance of the grief experience. It actually just kind of says, oh, don't worry about it. Time's going to heal. Just give it time. You'll feel better soon.
Right.
And that's not really what we need. We just need someone just to kind of sit with us,
It's presupposing that someone knows better than you do for yourself.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is we don't even know in the midst of our grief, which is even more important to leave it up to us.
Right.
Of course, there's room for guidance. Of course, there's room for support. Of course, there's room for a grieving partner. All those different things, but they come in their own time for that individual.
Yeah. So, with that being said,
can't put a timestamp on it.
Yeah, there's really no time frame, and time itself does not heal wounds.
Right. It's not time that heals the wounds. It's what you do in that time. And just because you put an end date on something, it's like I was saying earlier to you at home. It's like, okay, I'm going to open up a journal. I've got page 1 of the journal. I know that that's today. And then I'm going to take a thick part of the journal. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to write, this is the last page of my grieving. And then when I journal each day until I get to that page, I'm still grieving. But when I get to that page, I should be done. So, I mean, there's an example. It's like, that's just not realistic.
Right.
And it's definitely not fair.
Right.
It's not fair to the person, and it's not fair to it's not fair to their grief. It's not fair to that process. So the fifth myth is to keep busy. I know this is tough. This is probably really tough. I think it's tough for guys and gals. But it's like if only one of you are working in the household and the other person, or even if both of you have a career actually, and you get maternity leave and I have to go back to work 3 days later. It's easy for that person who goes back to work to get lost in their work and to just ignore or let go of the grief process. And when we say grief process, we're not saying like it's this big drawn out like extracurricular, activity that you have to go through in order to process your grief. We're just using that in layman terms, that there's a process, and you'll discover that process as you start the journey. And what does that look like? It just looks like day one is facing that I am grieving, and this is why I feel like I'm grieving today. And that's what we mean by that. But it's really easy for those of us who go back to work right away to get lost in it. It's also easy for those to encourage us, for others to encourage us and say, "That's great that you're back to work so soon. You're going to get past this, buddy. You're going to get over this, or we're here to support you in any way we can. If you want more hours, if you want an extra project," I was faced with that. If you want this, that, or the other thing to keep your mind off it, whoa, stop.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a total denial and depravity. It's depriving us, the griever, of the process that we are given to go through a grief journey.
Right.
We're given that opportunity. We can choose not to embrace it, or we can embrace it, right? So we have to be careful when others want to heal our wounds. We have to be careful when others want to help be the distraction and take away from what happened, especially with our partners. We need to be, I really feel like, this is for me, and this may not be for you, but I really feel like we need to be communicating as much as possible with as much honesty and sincerity with our partner. And whatever that looks like for you. But I feel like, everything starts at home and then branches out from there, especially if you're married or committed in a partnership, with a lifetime partnership with a person. The conversation should always start with each other. And child loss, pregnancy and infant loss is no different. In fact, it's probably even more crucial and even more critical that we're not only sharing with the other person how we're feeling and making an available space for them to share with us, but that we're also asking, how are you doing today? Or how have you been doing the last week? Or as time goes on, how have you been doing the last month or 6 months or year?
I think it's kind of an overall theme is that the journey to healing is going to take effort, and it's going to take steps by you, the griever, to make those little investments in yourself and also in your relationships. So I think just everything, all of the 6 myths is kind of has that underlying theme that we need to take effort if that's what you want. And so, keeping busy is going to be a distraction from that, and it might be okay for a little while, but it's kind of like that, kettle that's boiling. If you leave it too long, it's going to just steam, it's going to whistle, it might bubble over, unless we take time to tend to it. And so that's kind of an analogy there, but that's something to think about. So, okay. So the last myth, number 6, is be strong for others. And again, this is another one of those ones that we hear often. I've heard often myself. And people have said to me, when I was telling them about what was happening with our daughter, we were still pregnant, and, and they're grieving with us, they're crying with us, and they're saying, "I'm sorry, I'm crying. I know I need to be strong for you." And I admire and respect and appreciate their support.
Right.
But it's also, we don't need to be, there's times where we don't need to be, or we can't be strong for others. I think there's this big push in our society that we have to be strong. We have to be independent. We have to be successful. Right. And,
or that one of us needs to be the strong one for the other one. There's that too.
Yeah. And it's okay if you have times where you don't feel strong.
Right.
There's times when you need help, and that's okay. Right. We can't walk through life and go through all of the ups and downs in our life alone.
Mhm.
I mean, you can, but it's really hard and it's
Right.
really isolating. And I think it just takes away from that sense of community and family that can bring, and it just enriches your life all that
Right.
much more to have people come alongside you and support you and lift you up when you don't necessarily have the strength to do it on your own.
Mhm.
So I think as in our society, there's just this push of like, I've got to do it. It's all up to
Right.
me kind of idea. And in our really hard times when we are going through really difficult things, whether it's a loss or end of a relationship, anything, that it's okay for us to accept help. Like if
Right.
someone wants to bring us a meal, that's okay. Let them bring you a
Right.
meal. And
Or someone wants to pick your kids up from school or take them to school. You don't have to be strong for your children all the time either, right? You need to have time to be normal,
yeah,
and to have that breakdown moment, the emotions, the tears that are just welling up inside that need out.
yeah,
I think for moms that have existing children, I think that's I think the be strong for others, it like that just screams inside of me. It's like I need to be strong for my children. The daily tasks don't end, the daily routine doesn't end. So there's a lot of need for support.
yeah.
There's not a
And
lot
I
of need
think
for
when
support.
it comes to kids too, and you kind of touched on it before with the first myth about, here, have a cookie, is that we do need to have a balance of showing our children, our living children, that it is okay to have difficult days. It is okay to show emotions.
Right, to be
And
sad.
yeah, and I think especially as young kids need to learn that that's okay in a safe environment, that it's okay to have, set that example for your kids, because they may end up thinking that it's not okay for them to cry. It's not
Right.
okay for them to struggle with conflicting feelings because they didn't see how that was exhibited
Displayed, right.
by their
And that'll
parents.
vary for every family. I mean, some people are able to are deeply emotional. Other people are surface emotional. Other people don't talk about emotion at all. So we're not trying to say, don't, be something that you're not.
Right.
We're just saying that if you're feeling it, embrace it. If you're sensing it, embrace it. Whatever your body is telling you, embrace it. And see where the journey takes you.
Though everyone experiences grief in their lifetime, grief is unique and it is personal. Grief is raw. And when we truly grieve, we show our vulnerable side. Others see us as brave for revealing and sharing it, but there are many who are frightened by it. Our ability to be vulnerable can do two things. One, it invites others to be vulnerable also. And two, it scares others as they fear it requires their vulnerability as well. Being vulnerable can say, I am strong, or it can say, I'm weak. Our society norm says it's better to be strong than weak. Depending on how you look at it, it can cause many to run away or draw near to it. So how are you going to look at it?
It's sad, but in some regard, in some respect, us processing our grief and being open with it is possibly, most of the times it does, is going to change some of our relationships with other people, good, bad, or otherwise. It's different for everyone, but that outweighs, does not outweigh the positive outcome from facing our grief, talking about, wrestling with our grief, and healing from our grief. That's what we want for you guys. We want you guys to find strength in the healing and to be fierce with embracing grief, so that you can have freedom, really is what it comes down to. But it's not perfect.
Right.
It's a process, and life is a journey, for sure. Cool. All right, you guys, if you got value out of this episode, please, 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 please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel so you get alerts when we release new content every week, like this podcast. So if you like this episode and you want to see more of our weekly podcasts, we do have them on the link above. And also, if you want to go deeper, you guys, we do have a grief series. is called the pregnancy journey, grieving from the loss of your baby and beyond. And you can access that grief series in the link below.